It is the third week of the United States naval blockade on Iran, and somewhere east of Sri Lanka, far from the Strait of Hormuz, far from the Gulf of Oman, far from any theater of war that anyone has been watching, a rusting motor tanker called the Tiffany is drifting in open water. Her crew believes they are safe. They are deep in the Indian Ocean, thousands of miles from the blockade line. No warships in sight, no helicopters overhead, no destroyers on the horizon. Just open sea and the quiet hum of an engine pushing sanctioned Iranian crude oil toward a buyer who will never receive it. And then, in the middle of the night, United States Marines board the vessel. No shots fired, no resistance, just the sound of boots on steel and the slow, sinking realization that there is no corner of any ocean where Iran can hide anymore. 2 days earlier, another Iranian vessel, the Touska, had been seized in the Gulf of Oman after ignoring direct warnings from a United States warship for 6 straight hours. 6 hours. An unarmed civilian cargo ship sailing directly into a U.S. naval blockade, refusing every single warning it received. The question was obvious. What could possibly be on that ship that was worth that kind of risk? What was so critical, so irreplaceable, that a civilian crew would gamble their lives against the most powerful navy on the planet? The answer just came in. And it changes everything we thought we knew about what Iran has been doing behind the scenes while the world was watching the ceasefire clock. The era of Iran quietly rebuilding in the shadows is over. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because situations like this are evolving by the hour. What the United States found on that ship has consequences that will reshape the next phase of this conflict entirely, and new developments are coming in as we speak. To understand why a single cargo ship matters this much, you first need to understand what Iran lost in the opening weeks of this war. When the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes against Iranian military infrastructure, the damage was not cosmetic. It was not a warning shot designed to send a political message. It was structural, systematic, calculated to degrade Iran's ability to wage war for years, possibly decades. According to Reuters, the strikes targeted Iran's missile production facilities, its air defense architecture, and significant portions of its naval fleet. Entire weapons depots were erased overnight. Assembly lines that had taken years to build were reduced to concrete dust and twisted steel. President Trump confirmed the scope of this damage in a television interview this morning, stating plainly that the United States has taken out Iran's navy, taken out its air force, and taken out its leaders. He went further, describing what has happened as regime change, stating that while it was not something he originally said he was going to do, he has done it indirectly. He pointed to the elimination of key Iranian leaders, noting that while removing leadership complicates negotiations in one way, the new leaders are, in his assessment, much more rational than their predecessors. Those are not words chosen lightly, and they paint a picture of an Iranian military establishment that is not just weakened, but fundamentally hollowed out from the top down. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, the backbone of Iran's offensive capability, was left with a missile stockpile that was either expended during combat operations or destroyed on the ground before it could ever be launched. Rebuilding that stockpile became the single most urgent military priority for Tehran. But rebuilding a missile program requires components that Iran simply cannot produce on its own, not under 4 decades of international sanctions, not with an industrial base that has been deliberately targeted and degraded. Iran needed outside help, and it needed it desperately. Now, here is what that actually means in real-world terms. Security sources told Reuters that the Touska was carrying Chinese dual-use military components, not consumer electronics with a vague secondary application, not agricultural machinery that someone relabeled. These were components with direct, specific military utility. Specialty alloys engineered for missile casings, the kind of metallurgical precision that determines whether a ballistic missile survives the thermal stress of launch or tears itself apart before it ever reaches its target. Precision electronics designed for guidance systems, the circuit boards and processors that turn an unguided rocket into a weapon capable of striking a specific building from hundreds of miles away. And pipes engineered for fuel lines, the internal plumbing that feeds propellant to a missile engine during the most critical seconds of its flight. Every single item on that manifest pointed to one objective: the reconstruction of Iran's missile capability from the ground up. This is why the Touska ignored a U.S. warship for 6 consecutive hours. This is why an unarmed civilian vessel was willing to sail directly into a naval blockade, knowing full well what would happen if it was caught. The cargo was not just valuable, it was irreplaceable. Iran cannot source these components domestically. It cannot manufacture precision guidance electronics under current sanctions. It cannot produce the specialty alloys required for missile casings without external suppliers. And now, it cannot smuggle them through the most heavily patrolled waterway on the face of the earth. Let that sink in. And here is the part that makes this significant far beyond the immediate battlefield. These were Chinese components, not Russian, not North Korean, Chinese. That single detail matters enormously because it reveals the supply chain Iran has been relying on to reconstitute its shattered military capacity. Somewhere in China, there are manufacturers producing specialty alloys and precision electronics that end up, through intermediaries, front companies, or perhaps more direct channels, on IRGC-linked vessels heading for Iranian ports. The United States has now physically intercepted that pipeline. The Touska is in American custody. Its cargo will never reach an Iranian missile factory. And every vessel, every middleman, every port operator that was part of that supply chain just received a message that no diplomatic cable could ever deliver with the same force. We will find you, and we will stop you. Now, let us talk about the second seizure, because this is where the true scope of what the United States is doing becomes unmistakable. The motor tanker Tiffany was not intercepted in the Gulf of Oman. It was not stopped near the Strait of Hormuz or anywhere in the Persian Gulf. It was boarded by U.S. Marines east of Sri Lanka, west of the Strait of Malacca, deep in the Indo-Pacific theater, an ocean away from the war. The Department of Defense released a formal statement confirming the operation and describing the Tiffany as a stateless, sanctioned motor tanker. The language of that statement was chosen with precision. It read, "International waters are not a refuge for sanctioned vessels. The Department of Defense will continue to deny illicit actors and their vessels freedom of maneuver in the maritime domain." That word, anywhere, embedded in the broader statement is the one that should keep every Iranian naval planner, every shadow fleet operator, every sanctions evasion broker awake tonight. This is not a blockade confined to a geographic zone. This is a global maritime manhunt. Here is what that actually means for Iran's economic survival. For years, Tehran has operated what intelligence agencies call a shadow fleet, sometimes referred to as a dark fleet. This is a network of aging tankers, often flying flags of convenience or no flag at all, that load Iranian crude oil at ports along the Persian Gulf coast. Once loaded, these tankers leave Iranian waters and drift into international shipping lanes, blending in with legitimate commercial traffic. They wait. Sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. When a buyer is found, usually in East Asia or South Asia, the oil is transferred at sea to a second vessel, and payment flows back to Tehran through layered financial channels designed to evade sanctions tracking. This shadow fleet was Iran's economic lifeline. It kept hard currency flowing into government coffers even as formal sanctions tightened year after year. It funded IRGC operations, proxy networks, and domestic subsidies that kept a restive population from boiling over. And the United States just severed that lifeline thousands of miles from Iranian shores. Not with a sanction, not with a diplomatic threat, with Marines on a deck in the Indian Ocean. Make sure you are subscribed to this channel because what comes next reveals how Iran's own strategic calculation about this war is built on a foundation that is already crumbling, and why the next 48 hours could determine whether this conflict ends at a negotiating table or on a runway. Hit that subscribe button right now. Here is the dimension of this story that most Western coverage is not paying enough attention to. Iran's leadership genuinely believes it can outlast the United States. This is not speculation. A senior regional intelligence source told reporters this morning that Iran sees this conflict as a game of endurance. The source stated that Tehran believes time is on its side, and that ultimately domestic pressure related to energy markets and the stock market will force President Trump to accept a deal on Iranian terms. That is the framework. That is the lens through which every decision in Tehran is being filtered right now, from military posture to diplomatic strategy to the tone of every public statement coming out of Iranian state media. And that framework is dangerously, perhaps fatally, wrong. Here is why. If we accept Iran's own logic, the argument goes like this. As oil prices climb and the American stock market falls, political pressure at home will force the White House to back down. In theory, it is a reasonable calculation. Wars that drive up gas prices and crash markets do create domestic opposition. But theory requires data, and the data right now demolishes Iran's assumption. The U.S. stock market hit all-time highs just a few days ago. All-time highs. Not a correction, not a plateau, record territory. Oil prices are sitting at roughly $85 per barrel. Yes, that is higher than the $65 per barrel when the conflict began. But it is nowhere close to the $120 panic peak that came in the first days of the war. The gap between where oil is and where Iran needs it to be in order for its strategy to work is enormous. Do the math. Iran is waiting for a crisis that is not materializing. It is betting its survival on an economic collapse that the numbers say is not coming. Now let us talk about what is happening inside Iran's own economy, because this is where the asymmetry between the two sides becomes devastating. Iran's economy was in distress before the first strike landed. Inflation was already running at punishing levels. The rial had been losing value for months. Youth unemployment was already a simmering political crisis that the regime could barely contain. And then the blockade started. No commercial vessels are reaching Iranian ports, which means no imports. No raw materials for manufacturing, no spare parts for infrastructure, no consumer goods for a population that was already stretched thin. And on the export side, the picture is just as bleak. No oil tankers are leaving Iranian waters through legitimate channels, which means no export revenue, no hard currency, no funding for the military operations, the proxy networks, or the domestic subsidies that hold the Islamic Republic together. Iran is not just losing a war, it is losing the ability to fund a war. It is losing the ability to fund a government. It is losing the ability to sustain an economy. President Trump addressed the blockade directly this morning, and his position left zero ambiguity. When Iran suggested opening the Strait of Hormuz as a goodwill measure, Trump's response was immediate. We are not opening the strait until we have a final deal. Not a framework, not a joint statement, a final deal. The economic shockwaves are already radiating far beyond Iran's borders. According to Reuters, Malaysia-based Carex, the world's largest condom manufacturer, producing over 5 billion units annually and supplying major global brands, including Durex, announced it will raise prices by 20 to 30% due to disruptions in the petrochemical supply chain caused directly by this conflict. Rising freight costs, rerouted shipping lanes, and delays at every major choke point from the Strait of Hormuz to the Suez Canal have left customers worldwide with lower stockpiles than at any point in recent memory. This is what happens when a war sits on top of one of the most critical shipping corridors on Earth. It does not stay contained. It bleeds into supply chains, into commodity markets, into consumer prices on the other side of the planet. No containment, no firewall, no immunity. And here is where the diplomatic clock enters its most dangerous phase. AP News is reporting, citing two regional officials, that Iran will send representatives to ceasefire talks in Islamabad, Pakistan, expected to take place tomorrow. Vice President J.D. Vance, who is heading the American delegation, has not yet departed the United States. The flight from Washington to Islamabad is approximately 16 hours. Iran, by contrast, sits roughly 1 to 2 hours away by air. The logistics suggest Vance will depart tonight to arrive in time for talks tomorrow. But the complication is severe and immediate. The ceasefire that has been holding for roughly the past 2 weeks is set to expire today, possibly as early as midnight. There is no realistic scenario in which the Islamabad meeting convenes before that ceasefire runs out. And the days leading up to this moment have been marked by chaos on the Iranian side. One Iranian television network announces Tehran will attend negotiations. The next one says they will not. Officials contradict each other publicly, sometimes within the same news cycle. Iran has a pattern of this kind of deliberate ambiguity, using it to buy time, to test reactions, to preserve the illusion of leverage. It did the same thing before the last round of talks roughly a week ago, sending contradictory signals right up until the moment its delegation physically boarded a plane. And that is why the only confirmation that matters is not a statement from a foreign ministry spokesperson. It is not a headline on Iranian state television. The only confirmation that matters is a physical one, an airplane lifting off from Iranian airspace and flying toward Pakistan. Until that happens, nothing Iran says publicly can be taken at face value, not a single word. When asked this morning whether he would extend the ceasefire to allow time for negotiations to begin, President Trump was characteristically direct. He said he does not want to extend it, adding that there is not much time. He stated that Iran has no choice but to negotiate, and that the country could get itself on very good footing if it makes a deal. But he also said something that carries far more weight for what happens next. When pressed on whether he expected to resume military strikes against Iran, Trump responded, "I expect to be bombing, because I think that is a better attitude to go in with." He added that the American military is, in his words, raring to go, and described the current armed forces as the most powerful military in the world. That is a president of the United States telling the world, on live television, that the default outcome is war, and only a signed agreement changes it. He also referenced the human cost of the Iranian regime's domestic actions, stating that 42,000 unarmed innocent protesters have been killed over the past 2 months, many of them hanged. He described the Iranian leadership as bloodthirsty, led by people who are tough in a way that is very negative for their own country. Sound familiar? It should. It is the same posture the United States adopted before every major escalation in this conflict, and every single time, the escalation followed. Here is where everything stands right now and what it actually means. The United States has seized an Iranian cargo vessel carrying Chinese military components specifically designed to rebuild Iran's destroyed missile stockpile. The alloys, the electronics, the fuel line components, all of it intercepted. Iran's most critical resupply effort has been physically stopped. Simultaneously, the U.S. has seized a second vessel thousands of miles from the blockade zone, proving that Iran's entire shadow fleet network is now being hunted across 2 oceans. The ceasefire is expiring. The peace talks have not started. The American president is publicly stating he expects to resume strikes. The American vice president is preparing to board a plane tonight for a 16-hour flight. And Iran is operating on a strategic framework that assumes economic pressure will force Washington to capitulate, while every available economic indicator says exactly the opposite. Iran's imports are severed. Its exports are severed. Its missile supply chain has been physically intercepted on the open sea. Its shadow fleet is being dismantled vessel by vessel, and its negotiating position rests on a reading of American politics that the stock market, the oil market, and the president's own words have already contradicted. And now we arrive at the scenario that has military strategists and intelligence analysts across 3 continents losing sleep. If the Islamabad talks collapse, the United States has already demonstrated both the capability and the stated willingness to escalate. But escalation against Iran does not happen in a vacuum. It never has. Every strike on Iranian infrastructure sends a signal to Beijing about the cost of supplying components to sanctioned regimes. Every Chinese-manufactured guidance chip found in an IRGC cargo hold raises questions about the Taiwan Strait, and whether the same naval enforcement architecture currently strangling Iran's economy could be turned eastward. Every barrel of oil that fails to leave an Iranian port reshapes global energy flows in ways that ripple through European gas markets, through South Asian refining capacity, through every economy on Earth that depends on stable Gulf crude. Will Iran accept terms that permanently dismantle its nuclear enrichment program and its missile development infrastructure? Will China quietly absorb the exposure of its defense supply chain connections to the IRGC and recalculate the cost of its strategic partnerships? Will the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical choke points in global commerce, carrying roughly 20% of the world's oil supply, remain closed until Washington gets the comprehensive deal it is demanding? The next 48 hours will not just determine the outcome of a negotiation in Islamabad. They will determine whether this conflict moves toward a controlled resolution or whether the world watches the largest American military operation in the Middle East since the invasion of Iraq enter its next and most consequential phase. 2 days ago, an unarmed cargo ship sailed for 6 hours straight into a United States naval blockade because what it carried was too valuable to turn around. Chinese alloys for missile casings, precision electronics for guidance systems, fuel line components for a stockpile that no longer exists. Iran bet everything on that single shipment reaching port. It did not reach port. It will never reach port. And tonight, as the ceasefire clock runs down to 0 and a plane carrying the Vice President of the United States lifts off for Islamabad, Iran is the country running out of time, not the United States. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single update as this conflict enters its most critical and most dangerous phase. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand what was really on that IRGC ship and why it matters for everything that comes next. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Iran will sign a deal in Islamabad? Or will the bombs start falling again before the week is out? We will see you in the next one.